Hey guys, it's Sean, the Christian Imperialist. And I know I promised this on X and it was before Thanksgiving. A lot of people have moved on from the Antioch Declaration, but I got my camera fixed. I got through the holidays great. Now it's time to record, and I'm having to record it a second time, so please be a little bit charitable with me. I have done this once before, but that was a terrible take. So let's get into it. In the last video, I mentioned that the Antioch Declaration uses a lot of language that they don't define, and they just expect you to use the general understanding of these words. And a lot of people will be like, okay, we know what this sin means because it's popular in our understanding. And the problem with that is, you see even in the Westminster Confession that when you're breaking down, what is a fourth commandment violation, it has to give you a lot of examples, and it has to give you what could possibly be covered in order to be transgressing the law of God, the moral law of God. And so they define terms, but the authors of the Antioch Declaration do not. And so the importance of that is, if you don't define terms, and if you aren't at least somewhat exhaustive or give anything, what ends up happening is that the language is susceptible to abuse. So, in the first video, I mentioned anti-Semitism. That's a word that they keep using that doesn't necessarily mean what they mean, what the word actually means. There's a lot of Semitic people, like Arabs, for instance, and so I have no problem with Arabs. I have no problem with Ethiopians, whatever. Those are Semitic people, but anti-Semitism in their use is the common use that just means anti-Jew. And so, because they don't define things, and because they just use common understanding, you have this moving target of what is anti-Semitism. And of course, how do you bring charges on that? So the point that I'm bringing up here is that you can't bring up charges on made-up sins, like, I'm going to go ahead and say it, anti-Semitism. You have to use biblical language to say that you've defied God's moral law this way. But if you're going to use biblical language, you use A, biblical words, and B, you got to use the words as the Bible intends them to be used. For instance, thou shalt not kill. Well, we all know this is more thou shalt not murder. For instance, it's November. I murdered a deer. Okay, I loaded up a gun. I stalked it. I shot it. I consumed its meat. That is murder. If it were a human. But the Bible says that doing that is not murder, even though it follows the same. I could use the same word, but it's not the same intent. And so it's important that even if you have biblical categories and biblical words, that you use it as the Bible intends. So today's video is specifically about one of those words that are on the list of things that the Antioch Declaration considers to be anathema. Today's video is brought to you by Vainglory. So, it sounds really, really bad. Vainglory. Ooh. Oh, yuck. So what is it? Is it pride? Is it vanity? It's kind of one of the root words in vainglory, right? Those are words that we're more familiar with. But in the research, when you start questioning and digging into this stuff, I find vainglory only twice in the New Testament. So, is it a biblical word? Yeah. I'll give you that. Well done, Doug. It is a biblical word. What does it mean? Well, the word is kino doxa. It is a two-part word. Doxa, as you're familiar with, means glory or esteem or opinion. Kino actually means empty. So, kino doxa, empty glory. Okay, so what does that mean? Thanksgiving was last Thursday. Right after Thanksgiving meal, I got up from the table and I beat Bruce Lee to death. Okay? This is my confession. I beat him to death. He was such a wuss. He could not fight worth a darn. Beat that little karate guy totally. Wait, what are you doing? You're boasting about? It's completely impossible. There's no way that I could have beat Bruce Lee in fighting. Not because he's, not at my house, but because he's dead already. So it's an empty boast. It is puffing yourself up based upon things that did not happen. And to use Strong's, yeah, I use Strong's occasionally. You need good Greek lexicons. Basically, Strong calls it a groundless or baseless conceit. And so it is a biblical word, so the drafters of the Antioch Declaration are correct. But did they use it in a biblical way? Well, I'm going to go to the Bible here, and then we're going to read the Antioch Declaration, and we'll see. So, 2 verses in the Bible. We're going to start with Philippians 2. I'm going to switch sides so I can see the monitor better. Philippians 2, it's in verse 3, but I'm going to read a little bit more of the context, and then the other one is going to be in Galatians 5, and we're going to spill into Galatians 6. So, because it clarifies what he means, what Paul means in Galatians. So, let's start with Philippians 2. Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Verse 3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. Kenodoxa. Empty conceit. But with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourself. Don't puff yourself up with emptiness, but rather build up the others. Pretty simple, but am I reading that right? Am I exegeting that right? Let's go to Galatians 5 and 6, because it's a little bit more clear. So, Galatians 5:26 has the vainglory word in it, but I'm going to start at verse 25, and then we're going to spill into chapter 6, because Paul actually explains what he's talking about a little bit better in the further down in chapter 6. If I were preaching this, it'd probably be all the same pericope, but the numbering system of the Bible is not inspired by God, as the Psalms will tell us. So, moving right along, Galatians 5, verses 25 and forward. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. Verse 26. Let us not become boastful, vainglorious, challenging one another, envying one another. Chapter 6. Brethren, if even anyone caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Okay? Empty boasting. If you believe yourself to be something when you're nothing, you deceive yourself. Continuing, verse 4. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have a reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. Wow. So here you have Paul saying that you can boast in things that you actually accomplish. What you can't do is boast on empty things, like beating up Bruce Lee on Thanksgiving. That's an empty boast. You didn't do it. It's a lie. It's conceit. But you know what? If you do have something worthy to boast about, that's allowed biblically. Okay? So, here's the funny thing. Let's go to the Antioch Declaration and see what they are considering to be empty boasting. Okay? All right, the first one. This is part of the list that I made a video about earlier, previous video, but let's listen. We deny that any particular view of Allied leaders, their strategies, or tactics during World War II should be a test of Christian orthodoxy. We further deny that this civic adiaphora may be expanded to cover malice, vainglory, keep those two together, race baiting, anti-Semitism, treachery, bitterness, or hatred. These issues are entirely distinct. So here we have the Antioch Declaration authors making vainglory a sin that is a test of orthodoxy. Okay, let's continue to the next instance. We affirm that God has ordained the existence of peoples and nations, Acts 17, 26 and 28, and such our cultural heritage is something to be grateful for, so that in view of God's good gifts to our people, national pride along with healthy patriotism are appropriate for Christians. At the same time, it is important to reject every form of identity politics, whether it be left or right, which is funny because they talked about the French Revolution, denying that, or whether the form takes is malicious or vainglorious. Malicious or vainglorious. So, the Antioch Declaration doesn't really mention what that means. They do say that you can have some level of national pride, so you can point to some accomplishment. It doesn't even say accomplishment. Maybe I shouldn't even say that. It basically says that you can be grateful for these gifts, like healthy patriotism. Okay, but again, it's using these terms as negatives, the maliciousness or vainglorious, but it doesn't really define it. So again, it's that moving target that if I were to bring you up on church discipline charges, I'd say, well, you're being malicious for this reason. You hurt someone's feelings. I don't know if you truly be malicious, or you're vainglorious. And because we don't define these terms, someone who's looking to sign this declaration doesn't know what he's signing. And so I had to do a little bit more research, and luckily for me, I did find this term in Doug's Plodcast. I hope I'm saying that right. Now, I don't know if all of his Plodcast episodes are actually in his Mublog and blog, whatever. Usually he records those into video form for YouTube, but regardless, the Plodcast is just audio from what I could find, and I found this term, and he calls it ethnic malice and or ethnic vainglory. He always puts those together. And in the context that Doug writes, ethnic malice is wishing harm or degrading or whatever towards an ethnicity that is not your own, or maybe your own, who knows? I guess you could hate on white people. I mean, apparently that's a thing now. So you have this paradigm of malice and vaingloriousness, and then he always throws in like ethnic. And so I tried to find where this paradigm came from. If he came up with it on his own. I did find some chick, Rebecca Dyke, like whatever DeYoung, has some book on vainglory. I don't know if Doug came up with this paradigm of ethnic malice and ethnic vainglory together, but I would point out that it doesn't really make sense. Now, I'm going to try to demonstrate that here on the whiteboard. So here we have vainglory. Okay. This is a noun. Now, here what I have is an adjective. And we're going to put ethnic. Okay. Now, usually when you have an adjective, it modifies a noun. Okay. But when you don't define terms and you're just using them as a blunt instrument in our day, we see that the adjective starts to just make the noun divorced from its actual meaning. And I'll give you an example. justice is a noun. If we add the word social justice, social to justice, is this still justice? No. What about, here we go, let's do another one. Climate justice. Is climate justice justice? No, of course not. So, Doug, whenever you add an adjective to a word, usually you're using it to strip the meaning. And I'm going to prove this here in a second. So, you say it's vainglorious to boast in Western civilization, or to boast in things that don't matter, like the accomplishments of people past who might have the same skin color as you or myself. That would be ethnic vainglory, because you're either calling them empty or just conceit. Which, you know what, if you call this ethnic conceit, if that were the words that you used, you'd be on point, and I could actually say you're using words well. But what if we say something like this? Oh, I can't. I'm gonna get a joke for that. So, education vainglory. What if I said that if you believe that classical education, trivium, whatever, if you believe that that is superior type of education to the slop that the Department of Education and the new math and all that, if you believe that your education, let's say at Logos School or New St. Andrews, if you believe that there is any merit behind that, you're committing some level of vainglory. How dare you believe that classical education is better than public education? Why not? Oh, that's right, because vainglory means that there's no substance behind the boast. We know that classical education has substance, and we can teach and catechize our kids in a biblical understanding to know logic and rhetoric and all these good things. It wouldn't be vainglory. But why don't I just call your school, your Logos school there in Moscow, educational vainglory? Why not? Okay? You get my point? Do I need to go one further? There's a great Christian comedian. Talks about Presbyterians having their superior theology. You can tag him if you like. I think I follow him. Theological vainglory. Well, why do we think that all Presbyterians and maybe CREC, I'm not either one of those, I'm 1689. Why can't we say that denominations are having theological vainglory? Well, because usually they have some substance behind it. It wouldn't make sense. And so you can say that you can have ethnic vainglory as a thing because there's no value in the substance behind the ethnicity. Ethnicity, yes. So I deny using an adjective to modify a biblical word so that it can fit into a paradigm just to say, hey, you're sinning against God's moral law. Again, ethnic vainglory, the vainglory of the Antioch Declaration, it's really not real. And so, I can't say how long we've gone. We're approaching 20 minutes here, guys. So, I just want to say, the words need to either be defined or they need to be used in the biblical manner, because you can't trace back to a podcast to get an understanding of what this declaration really means. Okay? So, if you wanted to be more correct, call it ethnic conceit. We know what conceit is. We know what ethnos is. If you want to say that it's conceited to say that the Brits conquered the globe almost, the sun never set on the British Empire, yet they brought Christ to more places than Paul could have imagined at the time. I mean, it was further than Spain, but that was his goal, to the ends of the earth. The British Empire did well. Is that conceit? Maybe. Is it vainglorious? Absolutely not. They did great. British Empire did great. I'm not British, but I will say they did good for the kingdom of heaven. And yeah, that's where we're going to end the video. The Brits did good. Nothing wrong with imperialism. I'm on brand. Take that.